Sometime in the 12th century, in a small English village that most people had never heard of and most maps barely bothered to include, 2 children walked out of the ground, not metaphorically, not in a dream. According to the people who were there, 2 children emerged near a series of deep pits on the edge of the village, disoriented, frightened, speaking a language nobody recognized. And their skin was green, not pale, not jaundiced, not the kind of off-colour you might chalk up to poor lighting or a bad harvest season. Green. The kind of colour that has no business being on a human being. The villagers who found them had no framework for this. Nobody did. And here's the thing that makes this story different from every other medieval mystery you've probably heard. One of those children survived. She learned the local language. She grew up. And eventually she told people where she said she came from. What she described was not a neighbouring village. It was not a foreign country. It was something that, depending on how seriously you take it, is either one of the most haunting accounts of a lost and traumatised child trying to make sense of her world, or one of the strangest pieces of testimony ever recorded in the history of the British Isles. Now, stories like this have a way of getting bigger over time. Details get added, interpretations get layered on. By the time a medieval tale reaches the modern internet, it's usually wearing about 15 different costumes, and the original underneath is almost unrecognisable. So before we go anywhere near the theories, before we talk about what might explain the green skin, the strange language, the impossible geography the girl described, we need to go back to the actual sources. The people who wrote this down closest to when it allegedly happened, because what they recorded is surprising, not because it confirms every dramatic retelling you might have seen, but because it's specific in ways that are genuinely hard to explain away. And we will get into all of it. The historical record, the village itself, the world of 12th century England that surrounded this event. The theories that range from the heartbreakingly mundane to the genuinely mind-bending. We'll look at what the girl actually said about where she came from, a place she described in terms that don't map neatly onto anywhere that exists on any map ever drawn. We'll look at the attempts to explain her story through geography, through illness, through migration, through folklore, through things that are harder to categorise. We'll try to figure out which parts of this account hold up under scrutiny, and which parts belong to the long tradition of humans making stories bigger than they are, because the truth, whatever it was, felt too strange to leave alone. But let's be honest with each other right from the start. We are not going to solve this. Nobody has. Historians, folklorists, archaeologists, anthropologists, they've all taken a run at the Green Children of Woolpit, and none of them have landed on an explanation that accounts for every detail without leaving some pieces awkwardly floating in the air. Which is exactly why this story is still being told 9 centuries later. It's the kind of mystery that is genuinely shaped like a question with no clean answer at the bottom. What we can do is get as close to the original event as the surviving evidence allows, strip away the centuries of embellishment, and sit with what remains. Because what remains is strange enough on its own. 2 children. Green. Emerging near pits in the English countryside. One who died without explaining anything. One who lived and spoke. That survivor's account, the dim green world she described, the underground passages, the land with no sun but somehow lit, the sound of bells that led them somewhere they couldn't find their way back from, that's what this whole story turns on. And whether you hear it as a traumatized child constructing a myth around something real and terrible that happened to her, or as something that genuinely doesn't fit the categories we normally use, it deserves to be heard carefully and honestly. Before we get there, though, I want to pause here and do something I always do, because if you're watching this right now, you're part of something I find quietly astonishing every time I think about it. Someone in the middle of the night in Tokyo, someone eating breakfast in Dublin, someone in a car in Manitoba with rain on the windshield, all watching the same story at the same time from completely different corners of the planet. So do me a favour. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are and what time it is. That's it. Just your city or your country and the time. I genuinely read them, and there's something about seeing Berlin at breakfast sitting next to Auckland at midnight, sitting next to Sao Paulo in the middle of the afternoon that never gets old. This thing we're doing right now, all of us in different rooms in different countries listening to the same 12th century mystery, would have been completely incomprehensible to the villagers of Woolpit, which somehow makes the story feel even stranger. Because here's what you need to hold on to as we move forward. The village of Woolpit was real. The pits were real. The writers who recorded this story were real. educated men writing within living memory of the event, not anonymous compilers working centuries later. And the girl was real. Whatever happened to her, whatever she saw or lived through or survived, she was a real person who ended up in a world that didn't know what to make of her. So let's start where she started. In a village in 12th century Suffolk during a harvest season, next to a set of wolf traps dug into the English earth. Let's figure out what Woolpit actually was, and what kind of world these children walked into the day they appeared. Woolpit sits in Suffolk, in the east of England, in a part of the country that is flat in the way that feels intentional, like the landscape made a decision and committed to it. The land there is agricultural almost as a fact of nature. Gently rolling fields interrupted by hedgerows and small clusters of woodland, threaded through by slow rivers. Today it's a quiet village with a church and a pub and a population that would fit comfortably into a medium-sized parking garage. In the 12th century it was something similar, just with more mud and considerably less certainty about tomorrow. The name itself is the first thing worth paying attention to. Woolpit almost certainly derives from the Old English wolf pit, which means exactly what it sounds like, wolf pit. And the pits that give the village its name weren't metaphorical either. They were real excavations, dug into the earth as traps for wolves, which was still a genuine problem in medieval Suffolk. Wolves preyed on livestock. Livestock was the difference between survival and starvation for a rural family. So communities dug large covered pits near the edges of fields and woodland, the kind of trap that would swallow an animal that stepped onto the concealed surface above. When the trap worked, you had a wolf. When it didn't, you had a deep hole in the ground near the edge of your village and a lingering problem. These pits matter to the story in a very specific way. They weren't just incidental scenery. They were part of the working infrastructure of the village, which means they were known features, landmarks that people passed regularly, places that marked the boundary between the managed agricultural interior and the wilder land beyond. When the children appeared near them, they weren't found in some remote wilderness. They were found at the edge of civilized space, at the precise point where the organized human world met something less controlled. That detail is worth holding on to because it carries symbolic weight even if you think the story has a completely rational explanation. The pits were where the dangerous things were supposed to fall in and stay. The economy of 12th century Woolpit ran almost entirely on agriculture and the services that fed into it. Most people in the village were villeins, which is a technical term for people who were legally bound to the land and obligated to work their lord's fields in exchange for the right to work their own. You farmed, you tended animals, you paid your dues in labour and in kind. The rhythm of your year was the rhythm of planting and harvest, lambing and shearing, and the terrifying gap between one year's stores running out and the next year's harvest coming in. That gap, which could stretch for months if the harvest was poor or the winter was hard, was where people starved. Not abstractly, literally starved. Diet in this world was monotonous and fragile. The majority of calories came from bread, usually coarse, made from whatever grain the household had managed to keep. Pottage, a thick, boiled mixture of whatever vegetables were available, supplemented the bread. Meat was expensive and irregular for most people, though fish was more common in a county like Suffolk, which had rivers and wasn't far from the coast. Dairy when the animals were producing it. Legumes, beans, lentils and peas formed a significant part of the diet and would become quietly relevant later when we look at one of the more credible theories about what happened to the children. The point is that this was a world where what you ate told you everything about who you were and where you came from. Food was identity in a way that's hard to fully grasp from the vantage point of a world where you can get mango in Manitoba in February. Vulnerability is the quality that defined this world most sharply. A single failed harvest could cascade into famine within months. Disease could move through a village before anyone understood what was happening. A lord could be harsh or arbitrary. A war or a dispute between powerful men could strip a community of its young men, its animals, or its stored grain with very little warning or recourse. People in 12th century Suffolk were not passive or simple. That's a condescending myth. But they were operating in conditions where the margin between stability and catastrophe was narrow and unpredictable. This created a particular kind of social texture. Communities were tightly bound and deeply suspicious of outsiders. Information travelled fast, but it travelled through a filter of fear, faith, and collective interpretation that could transform a strange event into a sign, a miracle, or a threat almost overnight. and there were outsiders moving through this part of England in the 12th century in unusual numbers. This is one of the details that historians who take a more grounded approach to the Green Children story have found genuinely significant. The reign of King Stephen and the period that followed it, sometimes called the Anarchy, had destabilised large parts of England. People moved, communities were disrupted, refugees from conflicts, labourers seeking work, families fleeing hardship, all of them creating a landscape where encountering someone who spoke differently, ate differently, dressed differently, or looked different was not as rare as the isolation of village life might suggest. Suffolk specifically had seen an influx of Flemish settlers. These were people from the Low Countries, brought to England by various Norman lords to work in the wool trade, which was one of the economic engines of the region. The Flemish spoke their own language. They had their own customs. They were recognisably foreign to the local population in ways that could make even ordinary differences seem strange and difficult to interpret. The question of whether the Flemish connection matters to the Green Children story is something we'll return to in more detail later, but it's important to establish here that 12th century Suffolk was not a hermetically sealed world of people who had never seen a stranger. Strangers were arriving, and the village communities were developing complicated feelings about them. What this means for the story is that when two children appeared near the wolf pit speaking a language no one could identify, the villagers didn't respond with pure rational puzzlement. They responded with everything they had available, which included a framework of Christian miracle and divine sign, a deep wariness of the unknown, and a social environment in which rumour travelled at exactly the speed of word of mouth, which in a small village is approximately the speed of sound. By the time anyone in authority heard about the children, the story had already been shaped by the community that found them. Every detail had passed through multiple sets of eyes and mouths before it reached anyone writing things down. That matters for how we evaluate the record, not because it means the story is false, but because it means the story is already interpreted by the time we receive it. The villagers who found these children weren't neutral observers. They were people who had a vocabulary for the miraculous, who lived in a world where God's intentions were visible in daily events, where the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was a great deal more permeable than most of us treat it today. If you genuinely believe that saints can work miracles, and that the world contains signs meant to be read, then two green children emerging from the earth is not a category error. It's a message. The only question is what it means. This is the environment the children walked into, a village whose name was literally rooted in the idea of digging traps for dangerous things, a community of people whose lives were governed by agricultural cycles, religious obligation, and a constantly present anxiety about survival. A region that was experiencing unusual movement and disruption, where outsiders were present enough to be a known quantity but not so common that they ceased to be unsettling. A world where the response to something inexplicable was not to suspend judgment and gather data, but to reach immediately for the frameworks that gave the inexplicable meaning. Rumour would have moved through Woolpit in hours. The story would have changed shape as it moved. By the time it reached the ears of the local lord, a man named Richard de Calonne, who would take the children in, it was already something larger than a simple account of two lost and frightened children found near a field. It was already, in some sense, a story. What's remarkable is that underneath all that, the core details stayed consistent enough to be written down by two different educated men, in two different texts, with enough overlap and enough divergence to suggest they were drawing on real information, rather than copying each other. That consistency, imperfect and partial as it is why this story has survived 900 years. Because even when you strip away everything the medieval mind added to it, something remains. Something specific. Something that doesn't have an obvious source in pure invention. And the writers who recorded it were closer to the event than we are to the American Civil War. The two men who wrote down the Green Children story didn't know each other particularly well, worked in different places, and produced accounts that overlap in ways that are genuinely interesting precisely because they don't overlap perfectly. That imperfect overlap is actually the most useful thing about them. If the accounts were identical, you'd suspect one copied the other. If they were wildly different, you'd suspect both were inventing freely. What we actually have is something in between, and that middle ground is where the historical investigation has to begin. William of Newburgh was an Augustinian canon working in Yorkshire, writing his Historia Rerum Anglicarum, a history of English affairs in the 1190s. This places him perhaps 40 or 50 years after the events he describes. which sounds like a long time until you remember that by that standard, anyone writing today about something that happened in the 1970s is working in roughly equivalent territory. He wasn't present, he wasn't a neighbour, but he was a careful, sceptical and methodologically self-aware chronicler, which for the 12th century is saying quite a lot. He explicitly states that he heard the story from reliable sources, men whose truthfulness he trusted, and he includes it not to entertain but because he believes it represents something genuinely difficult to explain. He frames the strangeness not as a failure of explanation, but as an invitation to take the story seriously despite its improbability. He writes about the children with the slightly reluctant fascination of a man who would prefer a tidy world, but has encountered evidence that the world is not in fact tidy. Ralph of Coggeshall was a Cistercian abbot in Essex, considerably closer geographically to Woolpit, and his account appears in the Chronicon Anglicanum, compiled in the early 13th century. His sourcing is, if anything, more direct. He claims to have received his information from Richard de Calne himself, the knight who took the children in, and also from a man named Sir Richard, who was apparently present during some of the events. This makes his account potentially closer to primary testimony, though filtered through decades of memory and the particular interpretive habits of a Cistercian abbot with an interest in marvels. Ralph was a collector of wonders. His chronicle includes other unusual events alongside the Green Children, which tells you something about the framework he was working within. He wasn't a neutral empiricist. He was a man of faith who found in inexplicable events the signature of a god who occasionally interrupted the ordinary. What the two accounts share is substantial. Both describe two children, a boy and a girl, found near Woolpit. Both say their skin was entirely green. Both say they spoke an incomprehensible language and refused to eat anything offered to them for a significant period. Both record that the boy was sickly from the start and died not long after being found, while the girl survived, gradually lost her green colouring, and was eventually baptised and integrated into English life. Both note that the children seemed distressed and disoriented when they were first found, and both record that the girl, in later life, spoke of coming from a place underground, a place where the light was dim and the world was organised differently from the one she'd been brought into. These shared elements form what you might call the core record. They are the details that survive the transmission from the event to writing through at least two independent chains of testimony, and their survival suggests they were considered essential to the story at every stage of that transmission. Someone who knew the story would have corrected an account that omitted them. That doesn't make them literally true in every particular, but it does mean that if you are looking for what actually happened, these are the details you need to account for. Where the accounts diverge is equally revealing. William of Newburgh is more interested in the metaphysical implications of the story, gesturing toward it as evidence that the world contains more variety and strangeness than human philosophy can compass. His account is slightly more polished, more rhetorically shaped, with a literary consciousness that keeps intervening between the events and the reader. He is interested in what the story means. Ralph of Coggeshall, drawing on closer sources, includes details that feel more like the residue of actual testimony, the specific texture of remembered events rather than the smooth surface of a story that has been thought about and given meaning. Ralph records, for instance, that the children were found at harvest time, that they were weeping, and that they appeared to have come from the direction of some pits in the earth, now frequently described as St. Mary's pits in the fields near the village. These details have the grain of genuine memory in them. They're the kind of things that stick in someone's account because they were actually present. This is the essential challenge of medieval chronicle evidence. You are never reading pure report. You are reading report that has been selected, shaped, and interpreted by someone working within a very specific intellectual and theological framework. A 12th or 13th century monk did not separate the factual from the moral or the miraculous the way a modern journalist is at least supposed to try to do. Everything that happened for a reason, and the reason was ultimately theological. Strange events were signs. The function of the chronicle was not only to record but to interpret, to weave the particular event into the larger narrative of God's purposes in history. This doesn't mean William and Ralph were liars or fantasists. It means their genre was different from what we now think of as historical writing, and reading them well requires understanding that difference. When William calls the story admirable and worthy of record, he is using the vocabulary of his tradition, where the admirable meant the wonderful, the marvellous, the thing that provoked wonder as a form of devotion. When Ralph includes the Green Children alongside other inexplicable events, He's placing them in a category his readers would recognise, the category of divine signs and mysteries, things that pointed beyond themselves to something the human mind couldn't fully grasp. What this means practically is that the accounts are not usable as straightforward evidence in the way a police report might be, but they are also not useless. The details that both writers include, independently, drawing on different sources, are the ones most likely to reflect something that actually occurred. The details that appear in only one account, or that seem primarily to serve a theological or narrative purpose, require more caution. And the details that grew in later retellings, elaborations added by writers working centuries further from the events, need to be stripped away entirely if you want to get close to whatever actually happened near Woolpit sometime in the middle of the 12th century. The most honest position is this: two educated men, neither of them fools, neither of them simple myth-makers, recorded a story about green children found near Woolpit. They recorded it because they thought it was real, or at least real enough to deserve a place in the historical record. They received their information from people who either witnessed the events or spoke directly to those who did. What they passed down to us is not raw testimony. It never was, but it is something. A signal, however imperfectly preserved, of an event that was strange enough that 9 centuries of retelling haven't been able to fully explain it away. The question is, what was strange, and how strange, and whether strangeness requires a miraculous explanation or simply a lost one. It begins, as far as we can tell, on an ordinary working day. Ralph says it was harvest time, which in a 12th century East Anglian village means the fields around Woolpit would have been full of people, cutting, binding, hauling, watching the weather with the anxious attention of people whose winter survival depended on what they got into the barns in a narrow window of half-decent weather. This matters because it tells you something about the circumstances of discovery. The children weren't found by a solitary traveller on an empty road where stories can grow in the spaces no one can check. They were found when there were eyes in the fields and people close enough to see and to talk about what they'd seen. The pits themselves, the wolf pits that gave Woolpit its name, were probably old defensive or trapping excavations, steep-sided, dangerous if you weren't expecting them. Ralph's account has the children somehow associated with them, as if they had emerged from that direction or even from the pits themselves. Later retellings sharpen this into something like an eruption, 2 green children clambering out of the earth. The earlier text is more restrained, but the geography is consistent. The children are where they have no business being, near holes in the ground designed to catch unwary animals. The first people to notice them seem to have been villagers working nearby. What they saw, according to both chroniclers, stopped them. 2 small figures, a boy and a girl, weeping, bewildered, clearly distressed. Their clothing is described as unfamiliar, made of materials and cut in a fashion unlike anything the locals recognised. Neither William nor Ralph gives us a tailor's inventory, but both emphasise the strangeness. This is one of the places you can feel the residue of actual reaction. Medieval chroniclers did not usually bother to point out that foreign people wore foreign clothes. For that to make it into the text, the clothes had to be more than just foreign. They had to be wrong. And then there was the skin. Both writers, independent of each other, specify that the children's skin was entirely green. Not tinged, not slightly off, but green enough that the colour itself became the defining feature of the story. We don't know the precise shade. Neither man had access to Pantone charts, and medieval Latin doesn't map cleanly onto modern colour terminology. But the important thing is not the exact hue. It's that everyone talking about the event agreed. Whatever these children looked like, they looked like no one the villagers had ever seen. Imagine being a 12th century farm worker, hot, tired, swinging a sickle in a field you've known all your life. You look up and there, by the pits where wolves are supposed to fall and die, are 2 children in strange clothes crying, and their skin is the colour of leaves. You don't have a framework for chlorosis, or metal poisoning, or dietary deficiency. You have saints and demons, fairies and strangers, divine signs and local gossip. The human brain does what it always does. It scrambles to fit the new thing into an old category and, failing that, stalls. That stall is where fear and curiosity walk in together. The children spoke, or tried to. Both chroniclers say they poured out words, but none of it made sense to the people around them. Not just a heavy accent, not just an unfamiliar dialect, but a language that no one present recognised. This matters in a way that's easy to miss. Medieval England was linguistically messy. In a single market you might hear Old English dialects, Anglo-Norman French, scraps of Latin from a cleric, and words carried in by traders from Flanders or beyond. People were used to not understanding every word. For their speech to be described as incomprehensible, and for that incomprehensibility to be deemed worth recording decades later, it had to feel more fundamental. These were not just foreigners. They were linguistically alien to the community that found them. The effect of that barrier is obvious. Language is how you quickly decide what category to put someone in: enemy, neighbour, fool, guest, supplicant. With the Green Children, that sorting algorithm failed. You can't ask where they came from, who their parents are, what lord they serve, what they're doing by the pits. All you have are tears, gestures, and the shock of that green skin. The situation is emotionally loud and informationally silent, and yet they were not stoned or driven off. Both accounts agree that the villagers took the children into custody and brought them eventually to the manor of Richard de Caen. That decision, if we're looking for something genuinely human and historically plausible, is one of the most interesting parts of the story. Because fear alone might have produced a very different outcome. Why did they bring them in? Part of the answer is practical. In a small agrarian community, stray children are everyone's problem. If they belong to a nearby household, that household will want them back. If they're orphans or runaways, the local lord needs to know, because unexpected dependents mean unexpected mouths to feed and potential trouble. There's a whole unwritten protocol for what you do with foundlings, and it usually ends up in some form on the lord's doorstep. Part of the answer is religious. By the mid-12th century, Christian charity wasn't an abstract slogan. It was a social expectation, especially with regard to children. Leaving 2 weeping kids to starve in the fields, even green ones in strange clothes, would not have reflected well on anyone's conscience. Villagers knew that their local priests and monks talked about entertaining angels unawares. You don't want to be the one who chased off the angels because their skin was the wrong colour. But there's something else that slips through the lines of the chronicles, something like astonished curiosity. William, who's usually quite dry, admits how remarkable the whole thing seemed. Ralph takes the trouble to trace the line from the fields to Richard de Caen's household. Those narrative choices suggest that the people of Woolpit did what humans often do when the world presents them with something that doesn't fit. They contained it. They pulled the anomaly inward, into the social order, where someone with more status could look at it and, they hoped, make sense of it. So the children are led, or carried, we're not told which, from the pits and the fields into the heart of local authority. Behind them, the villagers carry the first unanswered question that will haunt every later retelling. Why were these 2 alone? Medieval villages were noisy with family. Children did not wander miles by themselves without someone noticing. Travel was dangerous. The landscape was thick with stories of wolves, bandits, spirits in the woods. Yet here are 2 youngsters, no adults in sight, no escorts, no pack animals, no trace of anyone else. They are disoriented, crying, clearly lost. They do not know where they are, and they cannot say where they have come from. From the very first day, long before anyone talks about underground lands or dim green light, the problem is already there in its simplest form. 2 children, out of place in every visible way, with no obvious path that could have brought them to the edge of those pits. The villagers of Woolpit had to act before they could explain, so they did the only thing that made sense within their world. They brought the mystery home. At some point after that walk from the fields, after the first flurry of questions that went nowhere, someone did the obvious next thing. They tried to feed them. Ralph is the one who lingers on this. In his version, the children are taken into Richard de Caen's household and offered food from the Lord's table. Bread, we can safely assume, probably pottage, maybe some meat if the timing was right and the day was good. Ordinary things, the basic building blocks of an English peasant and minor noble diet. And, he says, the children refused all of it. This isn't framed as fussy eating. Medieval writers did not generally care if children were picky about supper. It struck Ralph as strange enough that he made it one of the central beats of the story. Day after day, he says, they were offered what everyone else ate, and day after day they turned away, weeping, gesturing their distress, but putting none of it in their mouths. You can read that in 2 very different registers at once. On one level, it's part of the miracle narrative. Creatures from elsewhere, so alien that they cannot stomach human food. This is a very old motif. In saints' lives and wonder tales, otherworldly visitors often have dietary rules that mark them off from everyone else. Refusal of food becomes a sign of spiritual apartness. On another level, if you've ever been around a severely stressed or traumatized child, it rings with a different kind of truth. Children whose worlds have been abruptly torn apart can stop eating, not because the food is poisoned or unfamiliar, but because their nervous system is on fire. The very act of putting something in their mouth can feel impossible. Whatever was driving it, the refusal went on long enough that people worried. Ralph says the children fasted until they were on the brink of starving. That detail matters. It tells you the household didn't just try once, shrug and move on. They persisted, they watched the consequences, and they began to fear that these strange green children might simply die under their roof without ever having spoken a word anyone could understand. And then, one day, something changed. According to both accounts, the turning point involved beans. This is one of those seemingly small details that, once you start looking at it closely, opens up an entire landscape. The story goes like this. Some green stalks of beans were brought in from the fields. In Ralph's version, they were still in their pods, the whole plants or bundles of them carried as you would bring in fodder or harvest. The children saw these and reacted. They suddenly brightened, made eager gestures, and went to the plants. Ralph says they opened the stalks expecting to find the food inside, and were disappointed at first. Only later did someone show them the actual pods, and when the beans were revealed, the children ate them ravenously. If that sounds oddly specific for a legend, you're not alone in thinking so. This is one of those moments where the story tightens into something that feels like it might be clinging to a remembered incident. Even if layers of interpretation have been added, the core, children ignoring bread and meat, then suddenly latching onto beans, is remarkably consistent. But we have to be careful with that word beans. In medieval England, beans didn't mean quite what many modern English speakers picture when they hear the word. These were not delicate green beans sautéed in butter. The staples were broad beans and related pulses, thick, starchy, durable seeds that could be dried, stored and boiled into the kind of heavy pottages that kept poor people alive through long winters. Along with peas, they were a central protein source for those who couldn't afford much meat. They were also, crucially, widespread. If you were a stranger displaced from almost anywhere in Northern Europe, the smell and texture of cooked beans would not be exotic. You might not recognize the exact bread, or the herbs, or the cuts of meat, but beans were part of a shared agricultural and culinary vocabulary stretching across regions. In a world where wheat quality, bread recipes, and even what counted as meat could vary wildly depending on status and place, pulses were a levelling food. Poor in Flanders, poor in East Anglia, poor in some other obscure corner, your pottage probably had beans. That's one of the reasons this detail catches historians' attention. It quietly suggests that whatever else separated the Green Children from their finders, the language, the clothing, the apparent colour of their skin, their food culture was not entirely alien. Something about those plants triggered recognition. Not, this is new, let us sample it, but finally this. We know what to do with this. The business with opening the stalks before the pods can be read in a similar double-edged way. From a folkloric perspective, it emphasises their strangeness. They don't even know how to gather beans properly, as if they come from a place where the rules of agriculture are different. From a more mundane angle, it looks like what very young, disoriented children might do when they see a familiar plant presented in an unfamiliar form. They know that somewhere on this green thing is the food they want. They just haven't learned the exact local way of harvesting it. The episode also invites medical speculation, which later commentators have happily supplied. If the children were already malnourished when they appeared, something that might explain a greenish tint to the skin in terms of anemia or dietary deficiency, their bodies could have been primed to crave whatever staples they had managed to tolerate previously. Severe malnutrition changes appetite in complicated ways. Certain textures become nauseating, certain smells unbearable. People recovering from starvation often can't face rich foods at first, even if everyone around them insists that's what they need. They reach instead for the bland, the familiar, the easily digestible. Layer on top of that the psychological load. Two children, abruptly separated from their environment, possibly from their family, caught in a storm of incomprehensible sound and attention. Shock alone can shut down appetite. add strange tastes and smells, and refusal makes sense long before you need miracle or malice. There is also the possibility of cultural food taboos. Many societies, medieval and modern, have rules about what is acceptable to eat, what is clean or unclean, what is fit for certain days or certain people. If the children did come from a marginal community, a group of migrants perhaps, or religious outsiders, those rules could have been drilled into them early. Presented with unfamiliar dishes, they might have reacted not just with distaste but with fear. Beans, on the other hand, might have slotted safely into the category of allowed foods. We don't have enough data to decide between these options. What we do have is a narrative hinge. The beans episode is the moment when the story shifts from shock and refusal toward adaptation. The children begin to eat. Once they begin to eat, they begin, slowly, to live. And in the way the chroniclers tell it, that first mouthful of beans is also the first clue. It hints that beneath the green skin and the strange language, these are not creatures of another metaphysical order. They are hungry in familiar ways. Their bodies respond to the same crops that fed the poor across half of Europe. Their ignorance about stalks and pods is the ignorance of childhood or of different farming practice, not of some mythical underworld where plants don't grow. Later in the story, people will argue about chlorosis and arsenic, about displaced Flemings and fairy realms, about whether the skin colour is a symptom, a symbol, or a literary flourish. They will bring in medicine, anthropology, and folklore to try to pin down what the Green Children were. But all of those later interpretations are in some sense foreshadowed in this domestic, almost comic little scene. Two small, frightened figures ignoring the Lord's bread and meat, lunging at armfuls of field beans as if they have just glimpsed, in a foreign house, the one thing that feels like home. Once they started eating, everything did not magically resolve. Ralph and William both agree on that, even if they handle the details a little differently. The beans opened a door, but what waited on the other side was not a fairy tale recovery. It was a hard, uneven climb back towards something like health. And the two children did not climb at the same pace. We're told that, after that first breakthrough, they were gradually weaned onto other foods. Beans may have been the anchor, the safe harbour, but in a medieval household you didn't build an entire diet around one ingredient if you could help it. Pottages thickened with grains and peas, coarse bread, vegetables from the garden, scraps of meat or bacon fat on better days. This was the revolving menu. Over weeks and months, the chroniclers say, the children began to accept more of it. And here, for the first time, their paths diverge. The girl, we're told, adapted. Slowly at first, cautiously, but unmistakably. She ate, she slept, she put on weight. The green in her skin, which had struck everyone so forcefully at the beginning, began to fade. Her colour changed, Ralph says, until she appeared like the rest of us. In other words, whatever had set her apart visually was melting into the background of ordinary village life. The boy did not follow her. Both writers are clear that he sickened. They don't give us a doctor's report. That wasn't how medieval chroniclers operated. They don't list symptoms or speculate about proximate causes. The boy, they say, wasted away, was overtaken by illness, and died shortly after his baptism. In narrative terms, it happens quickly. One moment the children are a pair, a matched set of mysteries. The next, one half of that set is gone. Shortly is, of course, a relative word. Are we talking days, weeks, a season? The texts don't pin it down. But the sense is of an early failure to thrive. In a story that lingers over other details, beans, clothing, language, that brevity is its own kind of message. The boy's decline is not treated as a long saga. It's a downward line that never really turns upward. How would his hosts have understood that? In a 12th century village, unexplained sickness was not rare. Children died, adults died. Sometimes whole households went under in what we would now label epidemics. When someone wasted away without an obvious wound or accident, people reached for the explanatory frameworks they had. Sin, demonic attack, the mysterious workings of divine will, the malefic envy of neighbours, bad air and dangerous planets. At the same time, they were not oblivious to patterns. Medieval people knew, in a practical, non-theoretical way, that some bodies were just weaker than others, that certain children never took even when given good food, that sickness followed famine and stress. If the boy had been starved and terrified before he ever reached Woolpit, his reserves would have been low. The sudden shift in diet, climate, routine and emotional environment could easily have broken whatever fragile balance he'd been maintaining. Modern readers are quick to supply medical labels: refeeding syndrome, acute infections, chronic malnutrition, maybe underlying conditions like congenital heart defects or immune vulnerabilities. Those are plausible lenses, but they're ours, not Ralph's. For the people around the boy's bed, the experience would have been much more stark and much less clinical. Here is a child who arrived in a state of marvel, green and strange. Here is the same child shrinking into fever and pallor, just as the miracle of his presence had begun to normalize. And then he is a body to be buried under the same consecrated earth as any other Christian. The baptism detail is important here. Ralph makes a point of saying the boy was baptized and that this happened before he died. That isn't just a pious footnote. In medieval Christian thought, baptism marked the passage from dangerous spiritual limbo into the safety of the church. An unbaptized child's death was theologically awkward. A baptized child's death could be framed as a soul safely received by God. For the Woolpit community, making sure the boy passed through that ritual before his health collapsed would have been a way to domesticate the uncanny. Whatever he had been when found, fairy, foreigner, or something in between, he left the world as a Christian boy. That framing would also have affected how his illness was interpreted. A baptized child who dies is less likely to be cast as demonic, more likely to be read as a victim. His weakness could be chalked up to the damage done before he came under the villagers' care, or to some hidden judgment of God nobody could quite pass. His death might even have been folded into a familiar narrative of trial and mercy. The Lord, in his goodness, allowed this strange creature to be baptized and so spared his soul, even if his body failed. Meanwhile, the girl stayed. As the boy dwindled, she was moving in the opposite direction. The chroniclers don't say she was unaffected by his illness. They simply don't dwell on her grief. Medieval writers were not in the habit of describing children's inner lives. What they do emphasize is her physical and social transformation. She continues to eat. Her face fills out. The green fades. She learns enough of the language to make her needs known. She survives. It's tempting to see this as straightforward biology. Perhaps she was just a little older, or a little more robust. Perhaps her body handled the stress and the dietary shift more effectively. Maybe she escaped some infection that caught her brother. Chance alone can kill one sibling and spare another. But on the narrative level, something else is happening. The story is shedding one of its mysteries in order to concentrate everything on the other. Two green children are an event. One surviving green girl is a character. Once the boy is gone, the girl is no longer just part of a pair of curiosities. She's the only one left who carries the memory of wherever they came from, the only bridge between the ordinary world of Woolpit and the elsewhere that briefly intruded into it. Her recovery, then, is not just a medical note, it's the establishment of a witness. The chroniclers tell us that as she grew healthier, her greenish hue disappeared. That detail has fed modern hypotheses about nutritional deficiency, iron-poor blood, and the effects of a more varied, protein-rich diet. An anemic child taken from a monotonous, inadequate food supply and given better fare will often pink up over time. So the fading colour fits a naturalistic explanation. Remove the stressor, repair the diet, and the symptom goes. It also works symbolically. The more she eats the food of Woolpit, speaks its language, and lives within its rhythms, the less visibly other she becomes. Her body literally takes on the colours of the local population. By the time Ralph is writing, he can speak of her as having been baptized, instructed in the faith, and living among us like any other. The green is a past tense, yet the past is not erased. Even if her skin now looks like everyone else's, the memory of its earlier colour remains. It's mentioned every time the story is retold. Her current normalcy only heightens the contrast with her origins. She can pass, she can marry, she can work, but she cannot entirely escape the fact that she once stepped out of a pit with a dead brother and skin the colour of unripe wheat. And that is where this section of the story leaves us, with a single surviving child, half absorbed into her new world, half branded by the strangeness of her entry into it. The boy's death narrows the narrative down to her. Whatever their origin, whatever the truth behind the green hue and the incomprehensible language, there is now only one person who might someday be able to explain it. One voice, slowly gaining the words needed to tell a story no one else in Woolpit could possibly know. Language probably came to her in the least mysterious way possible, in a kitchen, not in some formal lesson, not as a project for priests or scholars, but in the daily collision of needs and commands inside a medieval household. Someone points to the bread and says the word. Someone else shoos her away from the fire with a sharp phrase. A name gets snapped across the room when she's in the way, or whispered a little more softly when she's being coaxed to eat. Ralph's account makes it sound almost automatic. After some time, he says, the girl learned to speak English and could explain where she came from, but that smooth sentence hides what must have been a long, messy, deeply human process. Imagine the shape of her days after the first crisis passed. She's no longer just the green girl. She's a mouth to feed, clothes to wash, a body that has to be kept warm and reasonably clean. That means she belongs somewhere specific. Medieval writers say she was received into the household of Richard de Calne, a local landholder. That word, received, does a lot of work. It implies hospitality, but also hierarchy. She's not adopted in any modern legal sense. She's taken in. What does care look like in that setting? A 12th century gentry household is not a cosy nuclear family. It's an economic unit and a little power centre, with land to manage, rents to collect, servants to direct, animals to tend. Children, whether born to the family or taken in from outside, are part of that system. They are expected to contribute, eventually if not immediately. So, care here means food, shelter, some measure of protection, and a place in the working rhythm of the house. It means someone making sure she has a pallet by the hearth or space in a loft. It means a woman, maybe the lady of the house, more likely a senior servant, checking that she eats what she's given, that she isn't wandering out into the fields or back toward the pits. It means older children modelling tasks and, without thinking too much about it, modelling language. Language acquisition in that environment isn't cute or pedagogical. It's blunt force necessity. A little girl who doesn't understand come here, stop, hold this is a problem. So repetition kicks in. Names of objects get hammered into her awareness because they're associated with food or pain or comfort. Over time, the incomprehensible noise of Middle English starts to break up into pieces with edges. Bread, water, fire, dog, stay. There's probably a point, months in, maybe longer, when she crosses an invisible threshold. She goes from being mimed at to being spoken to. Adults stop assuming she understands nothing and start assuming she understands at least the basics. That shift is powerful. Once people believe you can understand, they talk differently around you. They ask questions, even if they're simple ones. They expect answers. At some stage in that progression, the church steps in. Both chroniclers are clear that the children were baptized. The boy's baptism gets tied closely to his death. The girl's is mentioned more in passing, folded into the description of her integration. But in 12th century England, baptism isn't just a bit of private piety. It's your official entry into the community. To be baptized is to be claimed. The ritual itself is basic. Water, words, a sign of the cross, the naming. Theologically, it wipes away sin and marks the soul for God. Socially, it marks you as Christian rather than pagan, insider rather than outsider. For the green girl, that distinction would have been especially sharp. Whatever she had been before, a wild child, a foreigner, an emissary from some imagined underground land, after baptism she is, on paper and in memory, one of us. Conversion in medieval England is not the stuff of personal testimony and individual searching that modern audiences might imagine. It is largely a matter of belonging where you live. If you reside in a Christian community, you're expected to be Christian. The villagers of Woolpit, and certainly a man like Richard de Calne, would have been uneasy keeping a clearly unbaptized, clearly strange child indefinitely under their roof. Baptism solves that tension. It domesticates the uncanny. And with baptism almost certainly comes a new name. Neither Ralph nor William preserves whatever she was originally called. They don't even hint at it. Later versions of the story, written centuries afterward, give her a Christian name and sometimes a surname through marriage, but those are retrospective constructions. The silence in the early texts is telling. Her old name, spoken in that foreign tongue she arrived with, disappears from the record the moment she becomes legible to the village. This is how identity gets rewritten quietly. If she receives a baptismal name, Marjorie, Agnes, Alice, something ordinary, it's not just a label, it's a template for how others will imagine her. A girl named Agnes has saint stories attached to her, virtues expected of her, social roles mapped out in advance. Over time, people around her will remember less and less that she once had another name any of them could not pronounce, and more that she has always been Agnes, who helps with the geese and talks back a bit too sharply. Selective memory isn't just something historians suffer from. Communities do it instinctively. The strangest parts of a story get rounded off with each retelling. Anxious edges are sanded down. She came from nowhere turns into she was a foundling. She and her brother spoke a language we couldn't understand becomes for later neighbours she was foreign from over there somewhere. By the time she's a grown woman, the children she works beside or gossips with in the lane may know the outlines. She came from the pits. She used to be green. But those details will sit alongside more practical ones. She's quick with her hands. She's sharp-tongued. She's not from any family we can point to. Assimilation, in that sense, is a double process. On one hand, it preserves her. Without it, she doesn't survive. Being placed in a solid household, being fed, baptized, folded into the routines of work and feast days and fast days, those are the conditions that allow her to reach adulthood at all. The new name, the new language, the new faith, all act as shields. Under their cover, she can move around the village without constantly triggering fear. On the other hand, the very things that protect her threaten to erase the parts of her that make the story interesting to us. The original language she spoke with her brother? Gone, except for scraps preserved in her own mind. The landscape she knew before Woolpit? Replaced day by the map of fields and woods around her new home. Even her memories of the arrival might get re-narrated under pressure. If everyone around you lives inside a Christian cosmology, if priests and patrons nudge your explanations toward familiar patterns, purgatorial realms, miraculous deliverance, divine providence, then your own story bends to fit. By the time Ralph hears it, maybe years later, he isn't capturing a raw eyewitness account. He's recording a version already filtered through baptism, through a new name, through years of being Richard de Caun's girl, rather than a child of some unknown elsewhere. That tension sits at the heart of her tale. The same village that saves her life by taking her in also makes it almost impossible for us to see clearly who she was before they did. When she finally has enough English to answer proper questions, the first thing people want from her is geography. Where are you from? What land? How far? In which direction? Ralph says she spoke of a place she called the Land of St. Martin. William, writing independently, agrees on the name. That's our first clue that we're not dealing with a raw transcript of a child's words, but with a story already translated into a Christian frame. A medieval English girl does not, on her own initiative, label her homeland after a 4th century bishop of Tours. Somewhere between her memories and the page, a priest's hand has intervened. Still, both chroniclers preserve something strange enough that it doesn't feel entirely domesticated. They say that in this Land of St. Martin, everything was dim. The light was like twilight, or like the brief glow of evening after the sun has gone down. The atmosphere was greenish. The children spoke of a perpetual sort of gloaming, not full night, not full day. That is not a normal way for a 12th century peasant to talk about the world. People in Woolpit know cycles of light intimately. Dawn, noon, dusk, the sharp contrast of sunshine and shadow in open fields and under trees. They navigate their lives by the ringing differences between day and night. The girl's description, as it filters through the chroniclers, keeps stressing the sameness of the light. No blazing sun overhead, no real darkness either. Just a muted, green-tinted half-light that never quite changes. The land itself, she apparently says, was much like theirs in other respects. Fields, flocks, a church. That last detail is key for the writers. It allows them to insist that her people were Christians, that they honoured St. Martin, that bells rang and liturgy was said and sacraments offered in this other place just as in Suffolk. For a medieval cleric, this is essential. If she comes from nowhere that can be mapped with ordinary geography, then at least she must come from somewhere that can be mapped theologically. The Land of St. Martin motif does that work. It ties the alien to the familiar. St. Martin is a widely venerated saint in England. Dedications to him dot the countryside. A church of St. Martin means an ordinary parish, an ordinary Christian community. That label reassures the reader, however odd her story, it is not about pagans or demons. It is, in some sense, about us. At the same time, the persistence of the name in both sources suggests it isn't pure invention. Perhaps she mentioned a church that stood at the centre of her community, and someone local said, "Like St. Martin's?" Perhaps she latched onto that phrase as a way to anchor her own memories in a language she was still learning. Over time, the comparison hardens into an identity. Her home becomes, in the chronicles, the land of St. Martin, as surely as Woolpit is Woolpit. The most unsettling part of her account is how she describes getting out of it. According to Ralph, she says that she and her brother were tending their father's flock when they heard a great sound, like the ringing of bells, and followed it. William gives a similar outline. They were watching their animals. There was a noise. They found a sort of cavern or opening and went in. After wandering in the dark for some time, they came out into the blinding light and the unfamiliar fields near Woolpit. Notice how compact that is. One moment, pastoral routine in a dim green world. The next, disorientation in the full English sun. There's no description of an arduous journey across mountains or seas, no mention of days spent lost in a forest. Just a sound, a passage, and a sudden, inexplicable arrival. The route is effectively a portal, but a very localized one, a tunnel, a cave, a pit. Something that fits into the landscape people can see with their own eyes. Again, you can feel the compromise between experience and intelligibility. If, from her point of view, the transition was abrupt and terrifying, a shift from one reality to another, there aren't a lot of available narrative tools in 12th century Suffolk to express that. A cave that goes on for a long time is about as far as the imagination can stretch without breaking. The chroniclers dutifully record the essentials, but they also smooth it into a kind of parable. The children, innocent and obedient, follow the sound of bells, symbols of the church, and emerge into a Christian land where they will be baptized and saved. We have to separate as best we can what might go back to her own testimony from the framing wrapped around it, her likely contributions, that she came from a place where the light was strange and dim, that there were other people there, living lives broadly similar to the villagers, that there was some sort of church or central holy place, that she and her brother were with animals when they heard a sound, that they entered a confined space, walked for a while in the dark, and emerged into a shocking brightness near deep pits and unfamiliar fields. The chronicler's contributions, that the country was specifically devoted to St. Martin, that its people were explicitly Christian, that the sound was the ringing of church bells, that the whole episode can be read as a providential escape from a shadowed realm into the proper church. Even the phrase "land of St. Martin" almost certainly reflects the theological instinct of the men writing, not the vocabulary of a girl whose original language we don't know. And yet, stripped down to its bare bones, her story still refuses to sit neatly anywhere. If we take it literally, it implies a populated world adjacent to ours, accessible through underground passages, governed by the same God and saints, but lit by some other dimmer source. If we take it metaphorically, as a memory scrambled by trauma and retold under pressure, it still asks how a child from any plausible real-world community could end up in Woolpit with no one able to trace her origin. This is why her testimony becomes the impossible story at the heart of the legend. The green skin, on its own, can be chipped away by medical theories. The language barrier can be explained by distance and dialect. Even the clothing might be dismissed as foreign fashion. But the calm insistence that she came from a dim country where the light never changed, that she walked through a dark place following a sound and stepped out into another world, that crosses a line. It is either a description of something that cannot literally be true, or a garbled report of something so unlikely that medieval and modern minds alike struggle to place it. The writers do what they can. They baptize the geography with the saint's name, bolt familiar symbols onto unfamiliar terrain, and let the contradiction stand. Readers ever since have done the same. We can scrape away layers of interpretation, weigh probabilities, compare motifs. But at the core of the Woolpit narrative there remains a child's remembered crossing from a green twilight to the bright fields of Suffolk, and no ordinary map that tells us where exactly she began. If we're going to keep our feet on the ground, the first thing to ask is very simple. What, in the actual landscape around Woolpit, could make a story like hers feel at least vaguely possible? Because Suffolk in the 12th century is not a Tolkien novel. It's low, rolling farmland on chalk and clay, but that very geology matters. The name Woolpit itself almost certainly comes from wolf pit, the deep traps dug to catch wolves that preyed on livestock. These were serious excavations, steep-sided, sometimes lined, often disguised. You fall into one, you don't climb straight back out. Now imagine a child, already half petrified emerging from such a thing. From her point of view, she has walked a long time in a narrow darkness. The air has been stale, her brother's hand clutched in hers. When they finally see light ahead and scramble toward it, they're exhausted, overstimulated and blinded when they step into full daylight. The villagers who find them, on the other hand, simply see two strange children at the bottom of a pit, their skin an unsettling shade of green. No one needs to be literally tunnelling in from another dimension. All they need is to be appearing from below, from a place most people rarely go. And medieval East Anglia had more below than you might think. The chalk under Suffolk is riddled in places with man-made hollows. People dug for chalk to spread on fields as fertiliser, for flint to make tools and building stone, for marl and clay and sand. You get chalk pits, quarries, cuttings, sudden drops and hidden gullies, overgrown and hazardous. Some were shallow scrapes, others deep enough that, if you were small and frightened and not sure where you were anymore, they would feel like mouths in the earth. Add to that the natural solution features that chalk landscapes generate. Water eats at the rock, carving swallow holes, little caves, unexpected cavities. Most aren't dramatic caverns, they're cramped, twisting, uncomfortable. But they are dark and they can lead you out somewhere very different from where you went in. Then there are the things people build when they want to make wet, low land usable. Drainage ditches, culverts, early attempts at underfield channels. East Anglia has been a project of water management for a very long time. Before the great medieval drainage schemes of the Fens, there were smaller local efforts, cutting channels to lead water away, digging sumps and covered drains to keep paths passable. To a 12th century engineer, these are practical works. To a 12th century child, especially one seeing them for the first time, they're an underground maze. It doesn't take a purpose-built secret tunnel system to generate tales of people going in one place and coming out somewhere impossibly far away. It just takes a messy patchwork of pits, quarries, old mine workings and culverts, connected in unpredictable ways and separated by stretches of hedged, confusing countryside. Walk long enough, ducking through coppices and along sunken lanes, and your sense of distance and direction starts to wobble. Now layer darkness on top of that. Both chroniclers stress that the children spent a long time walking in the dark before emerging near Woolpit. How long is long when you're underground, or think you are? 10 minutes of stumbling in a pitch-black passage can feel like an hour. Lose your sense of direction, and you may genuinely not know whether you've turned once or a dozen times. Your inner map snaps. When you finally come out, you could be 1 field over, or 10 miles away, and subjectively the shock is the same. And in total darkness, your other senses go into overdrive. Sound becomes your compass. The girl says she and her brother followed a noise. The clerics gloss it as bells, because in their world the most meaningful distant sound is a church bell. But even if we peel that interpretive layer away, the core idea remains, a continuous directional sound pulling you onward. Parts of East Anglia were already semi-industrial in the 12th century. There were watermills on streams grinding grain. There were forges, hammers, carts clattering on hollow ways. Wind whistled through copses and across the mouths of pits. A mill's wheel or the creak of its machinery can carry unnervingly far, especially across still air or through enclosed spaces. The resonance of bells, church or hand, can bounce off rock and soil in strange ways. You can imagine the scenario. 2 children, in some marginal bit of landscape, perhaps near workings or pits unknown to us now, hear a rhythmic thudding or a steady ringing in the distance. It promises people, food, safety. They follow. The more they walk, the less sure they are of the source. In a confined space, the sound is both everywhere and oddly specific. You keep thinking the next bend will reveal it. By the time they see daylight again, they have walked far enough and been disoriented long enough that their minds knits it into a single uncanny passage. From dimness into blindness, from familiar routines into a landscape and a language they don't recognize. Looking back later, the road home is gone. All that remains in memory is that oppressive dark and the noise they were chasing. It is not hard to see how, told and retold, this becomes an underground emergence from another world. The villagers add their own knowledge. There are pits in the area, hollows that nobody trusts, places where men have been lost. They stand at the entrance to some disused chalk digging or wolf pit and say, "They must have come out of here." The chroniclers, writing decades later, condense that local speculation into a single imagined cavern that begins in the land of St. Martin and ends in Woolpit. From their perspective, the geography has done its job. It gives the story a physical hinge. It says, no, they did not simply drop out of the sky. They came through the earth by a route we might, in principle, walk ourselves. But notice how quickly that hinge turns back into metaphor. The more literally we try to map an underground passage from some known human settlement to Woolpit, the more problems we run into. There's no evidence of vast medieval tunnel systems in Suffolk that could have funneled 2 children undetected over huge distances. Mines there were shallow local affairs. Chalk pits and culverts don't secretly run for miles beneath the fields. At most, they're cramped, occasionally connected spaces that could disorient you over a short span of landscape, not transport you from one side of England to the other. So we're left with a spectrum. At one end is a purely legendary portal, an entrance to a fairy realm under the earth, a Christianized otherworld whose only cartography is symbolic. At the other end is a completely mundane mishap. 2 foreign children get lost in a confusing punctured landscape of pits and hollows, follow sounds that don't behave the way they expect, and emerge bewildered and sick into a village that has never seen their like. Between those poles is a messy middle ground, where real features of medieval East Anglia, wolf pits, chalk diggings, drainage tunnels, natural cavities, feed an imagination already primed by scripture, saints' lives, and folklore about people who vanish into the ground and come back changed. We don't have to decide exactly where on that spectrum the Woolpit story sits. The sources don't give us enough to nail it down. What we can say is that the underground passage isn't just a narrative convenience. It's anchored, however loosely, in the actual ways people in that region intersected with the earth, digging into it for survival, fearing what it might swallow, and telling stories about what lay beneath their own fields. Whether the green girl remembered a real, terrifying stumble through that hidden geography, or whether the clerics around her use pits and caverns as metaphors to make sense of her impossible account, the effect is the same. Her crossing is framed as a movement from below to above, from dark to light, from a dim world adjacent to this one into the glaring ordinariness of Suffolk noon. And once you picture that, children climbing out of a hole in the ground, shielding their eyes from the sun, it becomes very hard, even now, not to feel that something more than simple misadventure is being described, even if the only magic involved is the strange, unreliable way human memory navigates through darkness. Once you stop thinking in terms of hidden kingdoms and start asking, who, in the real 12th century world, could show up looking that strange and speaking that incomprehensibly? Another possibility creeps in from stage left. Foreigners. And in eastern England in the 1100s, foreigners very often meant people from Flanders. For centuries before the Woolpit story appears in writing, there had been a strong Flemish presence in England. Traders from the Low Countries worked the Channel ports. Craftsmen and weavers followed the wool money inland. Flemish mercenaries fought in English wars. By the time the Green Children were supposedly found, there were pockets of Flemish settlers scattered across the east and south of the country. They spoke a West Germanic language, close kin to what we now call Flemish or Dutch, dotted with loanwords and dialect quirks. To a medieval English peasant whose world revolved around Church Latin and a local Anglo-Saxon dialect, that speech would have sounded like a torrent of harsh consonants and unfamiliar vowels. Not Latin, not French, not English. Just not understandable. If 2 children turned up in Woolpit jabbering away in that language, it isn't hard to imagine villagers shrugging and saying, "They speak no tongue we know." That phrase, unknown language, is one of the hooks that makes the story feel uncanny. But it doesn't have to mean non-human. It might just mean wrong sort of human. Modern listeners underestimate how narrow most people's linguistic experience was. A knight or cleric might know French and Latin. A merchant might have heard snatches of Norse or Flemish in a port. But an agricultural village a few miles inland? Their world languages were the next parish over. So when the older chroniclers say the children could not make themselves understood at first, and that only after much time did the girl learn our language, that doesn't necessarily scream extraterrestrial. It sounds a lot like the way outsiders, especially children, are absorbed into new communities. For months, everything they say is dismissed as nonsense. Then slowly, painfully, they pick up the local words. Their original tongue is forgotten or pushed aside. By the time a monk questions the survivor years later, what was once a perfectly ordinary dialect has faded into scraps inside her own head. That disappearance of her first language then loops back into the legend. The less she remembers, the more unearthly her childhood words become in other people's imaginations. The Flemish angle doesn't stop at speech. It can also explain why the children looked so visually wrong. Picture a Flemish family relocated to some marginal bit of land in East Anglia. Their clothes are cut differently, maybe dyed in colours uncommon in that particular village, fastened in fashions the locals don't use. Perhaps they're poorer than they expected to be, wearing garments patched and handed down. Perhaps they cling to particular badges or religious tokens tied to saints, popular back home rather than in Suffolk. To their neighbours, this marks them out. To the people of Woolpit, who may never have laid eyes on such folk, these details can easily swell in the telling. A cut that looks a bit odd becomes strange garments of an unknown fashion. A small metal badge becomes some sign from their own country. A foreign way of crossing oneself or muttering grace before food becomes their manners and rites were unlike ours. Exaggeration is not lying. It's what happens when one generation vaguely remembers another's peculiarity and tries to turn it into a story that makes sense. And then there is the question of how two Flemish children might end up wandering, starving and green-tinged in a wolf pit near Woolpit, with nobody chasing after them. That is where conflict and displacement come in. The 12th century was not a calm time in England. There was the civil war known as the Anarchy, when rival claimants to the throne tore the country apart. There were local feuds, baronial crackdowns, estates changing hands. Added to that were broader European pressures. Flemish soldiers fought on both sides in English conflicts. Flemish settlers could find themselves suddenly unwelcome when their patron fell from grace. There are records, a few decades after the supposed date of the Woolpit incident, of Flemish communities in other regions being driven out, their lands confiscated, their people forced to move on. It is not unreasonable to think that, even earlier, smaller groups might have been uprooted more informally. Tenants pushed off estates, families fleeing a raid, mercenaries, dependents trailing armies and losing track of one another in the chaos. In any landscape where people are on the move, you get lost children. It only takes a small, ugly event, a skirmish near a settlement, a manor house torched, men-at-arms sweeping through to collect levies or enforce a judgment. Adults make a terrible panicked calculation. We have to go now. In the rush, in the smoke, in the stampede of carts and animals, two younger siblings lose hold of a parent's cloak. They hide, or are told to hide, until it's quiet. By the time they emerge, their people have gone, or lie dead, or cannot return. They head in what they think is the right direction. They're already scared, already hungry. They keep their private language because it's all they have left. They follow a sound, bells, a mill, anything that promises habitation. They pass through that confusing patchwork of pits and hollows we talked about. They stumble, fall, scramble, sleep, walk again. Days blur. Finally they see light at the end of some banked-out cutting or the lip of a pit. They crawl up, blinking, into a village that has no idea how they got there. If those children had come from a Flemish enclave somewhere in the region, the geography's not outrageous. We're not talking about a journey from the other side of the world. We're talking about tens of miles at most, perhaps much less, across a countryside where boundaries were hazy and wayfinding depended on memory and rumour. Look at a modern map and sprinkle possible Flemish locations across Norfolk and Suffolk. Places like Thetford, Norwich, Lynn, and smaller outlying settlements around major estates. The network of tracks and green lanes running between them and Woolpit is dense. A line from any one of those nodes to Woolpit is not a straight tunnel. It's a winding route along hedged paths, through woods and across open fields. It's exactly the sort of journey where you could have hours of darkness, disorientation, and the constant pull of some intermittent sound in the distance. To the people already in Woolpit, a pair of children turning up from the direction of, say, a recently troubled estate, speaking a harsh, unfamiliar tongue, and wearing odd foreign clothes, might have a straightforward explanation. These are poor Flemings whose people have been killed or scattered. To a cleric hearing the tale later with the messy politics scrubbed out and the emotional impact still raw, that can become something cleaner, stranger. They came from a land of St. Martin, of perpetual twilight, and spoke a language none could recognise. Strip away the spectral overlay, and you're left with a grimly human possibility. Not emissaries from a parallel dimension, but refugees. Children separated from adults by violence, trudging through a broken landscape until their bodies give out. In that scenario, the lost children pattern is doing a lot of work. It takes the painfully common medieval reality of orphaned wanderers and frames it in a way people can stand to tell and retell. Better, perhaps, to say that they came from a mysterious green country than from a burned-out hamlet up the road. Whether the Woolpit girl actually had Flemish roots is something we will probably never know. But once you place her in a region where Flemish migrants were present, where wars and crackdowns could scatter families, and where languages collided in confusing ways, the story shifts. The impossible becomes uncomfortably plausible. The fairy tale of children from another world begins to look more like a refracted memory of children from another culture, stranded in a place that did not yet have the words or the will to see them as neighbours. If the children were refugees rather than visitors from a sunless dimension, there's still something we haven't accounted for. Why green? Medieval writers are clear on this point, not slightly off colour, not sickly or pale. Green. It's the detail that makes the whole story wobble on the edge of credibility. You can imagine lost children. You can imagine a foreign language. You can imagine odd clothes. But green skin feels like a hard stop, unless you look at what happens to real human bodies under extreme stress. By the late Middle Ages, physicians had a word for a certain kind of sickly, greenish-yellow pallor that mostly affected young women. Chlorosis. Literally, the green sickness. We don't have to take every medieval diagnosis at face value, but modern medicine has a pretty good idea what many of those cases were. Severe iron deficiency anemia, chronic malnutrition, sometimes parasitic infections on top of that, sometimes all three. Take a child who has had too little protein, too little iron, too few calories for months, layer on long-term intestinal worms or other parasites stealing nutrients, then deprive them of sunlight and fresh food during a period of displacement or hiding. The result is not just a bit peaky, it can be a startling, unmistakable colour change. Extremely anemic people can look waxy, ashen, with a greenish or yellow-green tint around the eyes, the mouth, the thinner parts of the face and hands. In some light, to someone not accustomed to seeing such advanced illness, that doesn't read as very sick. It reads as their skin is another colour. Now imagine that colour on top of children who are already visually wrong in every other way. Wrong clothes, wrong speech, wrong manners. A story looking for a metaphor doesn't reach for, they were rather off-white. It reaches for, they were green. You don't need a modern term like chlorosis for medieval people to notice this. They lived with famine, poor diets, and disease constantly. They knew that some people went green when starved, weakened, or near death. Chroniclers were often clerics with some exposure to medical texts. The language of humours and colours was part of their toolkit for describing the body. Green belonged to cold, moist imbalances, melancholy, corrupted bile, the slow sinking away of life. In that framework, describing the children as green-skinned isn't just a visual note, it's a diagnosis in narrative shorthand. These are bodies out of balance, marked by hunger and sickness. Dietary stress fits neatly with the behaviour reported when they were first found. The children supposedly refused all ordinary food and would only eat beans at first, then gradually broadened their diet in their new home. That's exactly what you'd expect if their guts had been compromised by long-term malnutrition and parasites. Starving people can't suddenly digest rich, unfamiliar foods without problems. They cling to whatever is closest to what they were surviving on before. Simple plant foods, seeds, pods, the things they recognise. Now put these threads together. A marginal, displaced community, perhaps Flemish, perhaps just very poor, living on the edge of better lands, eating a monotonous diet low in iron and protein. Repeated bouts of diarrhea and infections, worm infestations chewing through what little is absorbed. A bad year tips into worse. Crops fail locally, or war blocks access to markets. Adults may manage to buffer themselves a bit by grabbing the choicest fractions of whatever food comes in. Children take the hit. The skin thins, the blood weakens, the world starts to spin when they stand. They still play, still wander, but everything takes more effort. When the catastrophe that separates them from their people finally arrives, violence, eviction, or just a desperate trek across country, they are already depleted. Then they stumble into Woolpit. If you start from there, the rest of the reported arc looks less magical and more clinical. The boy, in worse shape, never recovers from the shock of new food, new microbes, and whatever underlying illness he carried. He dies, as many frail children would. The girl survives. Her hosts feed her more consistently. Over months and years she gains weight. Her bone marrow finally has the iron and protein it needs to make healthy red blood cells. Her skin flushes. The greenish tint fades. Chroniclers explicitly say that her colour became like that of other people. That's exactly how iron deficiency anemia behaves when you remove the cause. The transformation from green to normal doesn't require miracles. It just requires enough years of porridge, bread, beans, maybe a little meat, in a relatively stable household. Parasites fit in here too. Hookworm, for instance, thrives in warm, damp soils and can cause severe anemia by feeding directly on blood in the intestines. Worms don't fossilise, and the chroniclers don't list symptom checklists. But if these children had been barefoot, poorly shod, or exposed to contaminated environments, their bodies would have been prime real estate for every parasite going. A new environment, different soil, different sanitation practices, and the slow attrition of their worm load over time would also contribute to their improving colour. So the green can be read as a sign of their suffering, not their species. There's another dimension, though, that has less to do with physiology and more to do with perception. Think about how colour is experienced in a world without electric lighting, in a rural village surrounded by greens and browns. Most of the time faces are seen outdoors or in dim, smoky interiors. The reflected light is green from hedges and fields, or yellow-orange from fire. A sallow, anemic complexion under filtered green light can look much more intensely tinted than it would to us under neutral indoor bulbs. Add in dirt, bruising, and environmental staining. If the children had been sleeping rough, sheltering in ditches, scraping against mossy banks and clay pits, their skin and clothing would have picked up colour literally from the ground. Medieval people bathed far less frequently than we do, and a child who had been wandering for days or weeks might be layered in grime. A thin, pale face framed by dark hair, with greenish bruises under the eyes and bits of moss or algae-stained clothing, could easily read as they were green all over, in the memory of a startled witness. Memory itself does some work here. The more a story is retold, the more its standout features sharpen. They looked unhealthy becomes they were oddly pale. They were pale with a strange tinge becomes their flesh had a faint green cast. A century later, a monk writing it down boils all of that ambiguity into a single vivid phrase: Green Children. You can feel the same process in countless legends and saints' lives, where ordinary wounds become rivers of blood, ordinary storms become darkness at midday. The green then is doing double duty. On one level, it is probably encoding a cluster of very real, very grim biological facts. Chronic hunger, iron deficiency anemia, parasitic infection, the ravages of stress on growing bodies. On another level, it is a storyteller's shorthand for otherness and estrangement. Green people are not like us. They are from outside, whether that outside is the next county over, or a half-remembered land of St. Martin that no map can hold. Treating the green as a clue doesn't mean stripping the story of its power. It means seeing that power more clearly. The same detail that medieval listeners took as a sign of the supernatural might, to us, be the fingerprint of poverty pressed into children's skin. And because it is so visually striking, it's the part of the tale that refuses to fade. Other pieces can be forgotten or swapped out. The green holds the narrative together, demanding an explanation. We don't have to choose between symbol and symptom. The Woolpit children could have been both desperately anemic and, in the imagination of their neighbours, emissaries from a place where the sun never quite rose. The green on their skin might have been the residue of famine and fear, which later tellers translated into the language they knew best, the language of colours, marvels, and worlds at the edge of their own. Once you let that possibility in, that the most fantastical element may be the most realistic, you start to see the rest of the legend differently, and you start to notice that strange, green-tinted figures aren't unique to Woolpit at all. Variations of them, in different guises, turn up again and again in the folklore of Europe. Once you start looking, it's hard to stop, because the Woolpit children might be unique in their exact configuration. Green skin, underground origin, Suffolk harvest fields. But the building blocks of their story are anything but unique. They're part of a toolkit medieval Europe reached for over and over when it tried to talk about the strange, the marginal, and the dangerous edges of its own world. One of the most common pieces in that toolkit is the idea of fairy children or changelings. In those stories, human babies are stolen and replaced with sickly, uncanny substitutes. They don't grow properly. They don't speak right. They refuse normal food. They might waste away unless someone forces them to eat or frightens the hidden spirits into taking them back. The logic is brutal but clear. In a world with high infant mortality and limited medical understanding, a sudden developmental disorder or wasting disease needed a story. The fairies took the real child and left this one is a way of giving unbearable events a framework. It takes senseless suffering and slots it into a cosmos where cause and effect still exist, even if the causes are supernatural. Now look back at Woolpit. 2 children appear, already wrong. They speak a language no one understands. They initially reject all food except raw or freshly picked beans. Their bodies show an abnormal colour. One of them fails to thrive and dies. The other, once normalised by speech, baptism and diet, survives and grows up. You can hear the faint echo of changeling logic there. Strange children who don't behave like proper Christians, who must be coaxed or forced into the right kinds of food, the right kinds of words, the right religious category. The fact that these children arrive rather than being swapped in cradles doesn't erase the pattern. It just shifts the emphasis from replacement to visitation. Another stock motif is the other world itself, a place adjacent to our own, reachable through pits, hills, mounds or caves, where time flows differently and the light is wrong. Celtic literature is full of these. The Sidhe mounds of Ireland, the hollow hills of Wales, the shining islands that appear and vanish off the coast. Anglo-Norman romances have underground courts, enchanted valleys, lands of perpetual twilight. The girls later claim, filtered through translators, chroniclers and centuries, that she and her brother came from a dim country where everything was twilight, and Christians ruled by St. Martin fits comfortably inside that imaginative geography. It feels less like someone's attempt to describe, say, a foggy fenland village, and more like someone plugging unknown origin into the otherworld slot their culture already had ready. Add in the way they supposedly came up, through an underground passage following the sound of bells, emerging bewildered into blinding sunlight near a wolf pit. Caves, tunnels and borders are classic liminal spaces in medieval storytelling. So are pits, ditches and earthworks. You go down into one world, you come up in another. Wolves themselves are boundary animals, haunting the line between forest and field, wild and domestic. Woolpit's very name, whether or not it originally referred to wolves, offered a ready-made stage set for a crossing between realms. Christian storytelling layered its own meanings on top of these older patterns. By the time our main sources wrote, England had been Christian for centuries. Monastic writers didn't just record wonders, they moralized them. Strange events became parables about faith, charity, and the all-encompassing reach of God. Seen through that lens, 2 foreign, half-starved children are a narrative opportunity. The villagers feed them, they baptize them. One dies, presumably saved by the sacrament. The other embraces the faith, learns the right language, and is fully integrated into Christian society. Her earlier difference, green skin, strange speech, is framed as ignorance and deprivation. Her later normality is framed as the fruit of Christian care. Even the detail that their homeland honoured St. Martin of Tours is doing theological work. Martin was famous for sharing his cloak with a beggar. To have green, beggar-like children come from St. Martin's land, and then be clothed and fed by good English Christians ties the story back into an economy of charity. It suggests a world in which saints and villagers alike participate in redeeming the lost. Certain recurring features of wonder tales anchor all this. Strange speech is one. Medieval miracle collections and travel narratives are full of people suddenly encountering a language they cannot understand. It signals both distance and hierarchy. We are here, they are there, and the gap is wide enough that only divine help or exceptional wit can bridge it. Refusal of food is another. In otherworld stories, eating the wrong thing binds you to the wrong place. Persephone eats pomegranate seeds and is trapped in Hades. Visitors to fairy banquets find they cannot return home. Christian hagiography flips the script. Saints refuse rich food to show their asceticism, or break taboos to prove that all foods are clean. In that context, children who won't eat normal bread or meat until gradually converted to it slide easily into a familiar pattern of dangerous or uncertain eating. Liminal locations tie the pieces together, roads, crossroads, forest edges, village borders, pits, wells. These are where marvels happen. If you were going to invent a tale about uncanny visitors, you probably wouldn't have them stroll in through the main gate at midday. You'd have them appear on the margin of things at harvest time, when everyone is in the fields and the boundary between cultivated order and lurking wilderness is most visible. None of this means somebody sat down and consciously engineered the Woolpit story out of folklore parts. What oral storytelling usually does is subtler. It compresses and reshapes raw experience into a series of memorable set pieces that feel right because they use existing narrative scaffolding. A real encounter, a couple of exhausted foreign children found near the village, gets retold and retold. Each teller highlights the bits their listeners react to, the language barrier, the odd clothing, the way the kids reacted to certain foods, the half-understood hints about where they came from. Over time, those details drift toward the nearest stable shapes the culture already knows. Fairylands under hills, Christian saints, perilous foods, pits and crossings. Events that may have unfolded messily over weeks or months get collapsed into one dramatic day in the bean fields. Long, grinding recovery from illness becomes a clear before and after. Green, then normal. Half-remembered conversations about geography harden into they said their land was called X. The story becomes easier to remember, easier to tell, more satisfying to hear. This is what folklore does. It doesn't prove that nothing happened. It doesn't turn real children into pure fiction. It wraps whatever kernel of reality exists in layers of meaning drawn from the culture's shared library of symbols and plotlines. It signals, not "this is false," but "this is how we make sense of the inexplicable." When we recognise those patterns in the tale of the Green Children, we're not catching the storytellers in a lie. We're catching them in the act of thinking. Their choice of motifs, fairy-adjacent children, underground passages, saintly lands, dangerous food, is a map of the mental world they inhabited. And to understand what those children meant to the people of Woolpit and to the monks who set ink to parchment, we have to read that map as carefully as we read any chronicle or charter. So where does that leave us, trying to weigh this thing 900 years later? We don't get the kind of evidence we're used to. There are no parish registers listing 2 unknown green children found in the fields. No inquest reports. No autopsy on the boy. No physical remains we can test for chlorosis or arsenic or copper poisoning. Obviously no photographs. Not even a sketch done from life. What we have are words. A few dense paragraphs in Latin written by men who never met the children, about events that were already in the past when they picked up their pens. That's not a bug of medieval history. That is medieval history. Almost everything we know about strange events in the 12th century comes to us that way, filtered through the priorities, habits, and blind spots of literate churchmen. Those chroniclers weren't journalists in the modern sense. They didn't go out with a notebook, take verbatim statements, and cross-check them against official documents. They relied on travellers' reports, local informants, older texts, and their own memories. They selected, rearranged, and moralised. But that doesn't mean they were just making things up for fun. Monastic writers saw themselves as keeping a record of God's world. That meant copying royal charters and battle lists, yes. It also meant preserving marvels, weird births, comets, monsters washed up on shore, talking animals, visions, and stories like the Green Children. Why? Because marvels were useful. They showed that the world was bigger and stranger than any one village. They served as warnings, signs, and examples. They could be plugged into sermons as illustrations of sin, charity, divine power, or human folly. A tale of uncanny foreign children who are fed, baptized, and integrated is a tidy little parable in that sense. You don't throw material like that away. So the monks took what was probably a local Woolpit story, already shaped by years of retelling, and slotted it into their chronicles as one marvel among many. And that's where source criticism comes in. Source criticism is just a fancy way of asking a few systematic questions about any historical account. How close was this writer to what they're describing? What were they trying to achieve? How consistent is their story with other sources? And what kind of text is this in the first place? Start with proximity. William of Newburgh, one of our 2 earliest sources, was born maybe 20 years after the supposed events. He wrote in Yorkshire, far from Suffolk, relying on reports that had already passed through several mouths and decades. Ralph of Coggeshall, the other main source, was physically closer, and seems to claim direct testimony from a man at the manor where the girl later worked. That makes him, in theory, a closer source. But he's still writing years after the fact, still working in a genre that likes a good story. Then motive. William presents the children as one odd marvel among many, partly to argue that contemporary England is full of signs and wonders, not just the distant biblical past. Ralph does more explicit moralizing, charity, hospitality, the universality of Christianity. Neither of them is trying to solve a detective case. They're trying to assemble a meaningful world. Consistency is where things get slippery. On the core points, the green colour, the strange language, the beans, the death of the boy, the girl's eventual normal life, the two early writers agree. That suggests they're drawing, directly or indirectly, from a shared oral tradition. But details drift. Their versions of the girl's homeland aren't identical. The way the underground passage and the sound of bells are described differs. Later writers in turn build on one or the other, smooth the contradictions or invent connective tissue to make the whole thing feel more coherent. Which leads to genre. These aren't legal depositions, they're not royal inquiries, they're parts of narrative histories and collections of marvels, written in a style that doesn't sharply separate fact, rumour and exemplum. A chronicler might preface a tale with "they say," or "it is reported that," and that was enough. The duty was to record notable things heard, not to exclude anything that couldn't be proved to modern standards. Centuries later, antiquarians and Victorian authors took those monkish paragraphs and did what they liked with them. Some added dialogue the original texts never contained. Some specified dates and names that were only vaguely hinted at earlier. Some folded in local folklore about wolves or pits or saints as if it had always been part of the story. Modern retellings often copy from those embellished versions rather than going back to the Latin, so the tale accretes layers like a pearl around a grit of sand. This doesn't make the whole thing worthless. It just means we have to be careful about which parts of the story live where. The bare bones, mysterious children, foreign speech, unusual colour, adoption into a local household, sit closest to the earliest texts, and may well sit closest to reality. The fully fleshed-out narrative of underground kingdoms, precise quotations and romantic subplots often belongs to later imagination. So how do we hold a story like this? One option is to treat it as a straightforward report. Something curious happened in Woolpit, and this is the best surviving account. On that reading, you try to strip away obvious exaggerations and look for plausible explanations. A medical condition, a refugee scenario, a case of extreme malnutrition and isolation dressed up in wonder tale clothing. Another option is to treat it as legend, a story whose truth lies less in whether it really happened, and more in what it reveals about medieval anxieties and hopes. Then you read it like you'd read a parable or a myth, paying attention to its symbols, its moral arcs, its use of saints and pits and colour. A third, more cautious option is to see it as layered memory. At the bottom, a real event. Strange children found, taken in, discussed. On top of that, years of local retelling, bending the raw facts into familiar shapes. On top of that, monkish editing for meaning. On top of that, centuries of antiquarian gloss and modern fantasy. Each layer tells you something different, about the children, about Woolpit, about the monasteries, about us. We can't tunnel straight down through all those layers to the bare truth, but we can feel the shape of what's buried there by paying attention to how the soil changes as we dig. And even if we never reach bedrock, the strata themselves, the way this tale has been told, trimmed and embroidered, are part of what makes the Green Children worth thinking about at all. If you strip the story down to its bones, what are you left with? Two children appear in a field. They don't speak the language. They don't understand the food. They look wrong. One dies. One survives by learning to live like the locals. That's not just a marvel. That's a social situation. And for a 12th century English village, it was a very revealing one. Medieval communities were small, tight, and suspicious. Strangers were risky. They could bring news, trade, and fresh marriage partners. They could also bring disease, violence, or legal trouble. Most people lived and died within a few miles of where they were born. When someone new walked into the village, or in this case was literally found in a pit, the first question wasn't, "What an interesting anthropological puzzle." It was, "Are these people safe, and are they ours?" The Green Children story is one of the very few times we see ordinary medieval villagers confronted with radically other children and see what happens next. They don't kill them. They don't abandon them in the woods as changelings. They feed them, baptize them, and give the survivor a place. That doesn't turn it into a feel-good fairy tale. The boy dies. The girl grows up but is described as wanton and loose, a slightly judgmental way of saying she didn't fully fit the moral expectations of her adoptive culture. Hospitality is real, but it's conditional. Charity is offered, but it comes with the expectation that you'll become, eventually, one of us. So the tale matters as a little window into how a medieval village might respond to vulnerable outsiders, especially children. It records both impulses at once, fear of the strange and the religious duty to care for the helpless. It's about who gets folded into the community and on what terms. It's also about how ordinary hardship can get turned into mystery when it crosses lines of language and culture. Imagine two malnourished kids from a neighbouring region, speaking a dialect no one in Woolpit understands. Maybe they're Flemish refugees from a border war. Maybe they're serfs who got separated from their parents while being moved to a new lord's estate. They're hungry, exhausted, traumatised. They have some sort of greenish tinge from diet or illness. From their own point of view, they've fled or fallen out of a familiar but miserable world, some cluster of hovels near a wood perhaps, or a settlement in marshy sunken land, and stumbled into a brighter, louder village that might as well be another planet. From the Woolpit villagers' point of view, they've emerged from nowhere. Now, at a language barrier, you ask, "Where are you from?" They don't understand. You point around, mime walking, point back the way they came. They babble something that sounds like gibberish. With time, the girl slowly acquires enough English to narrate a version of her past. But she's doing that in her second language as a child after a massive emotional shock, explaining concepts that her listeners already think they understand better than she does. That's how you get a land of permanent twilight and an underground world. Not necessarily because she literally came from a cavern planet, but because a dim place with little sun near a wood, across a watercourse, gets retold through layers of misunderstanding, analogy, and storytelling tradition. Hardship plus movement plus miscommunication can turn into the supernatural very quickly. A long walk through forest becomes a magical journey. A hollow way between earthworks becomes a tunnel. A foggy marshland becomes a land where the sun barely shines. The more distance there is between the children's experience and the chronicler's desk, the more those details crystallize into marvel. That's part of why the story keeps getting retold. It lives exactly on that edge between mundane tragedy and cosmic wonder. On one hand, it's the kind of thing that could happen in any age of migration. Displaced kids, adults projecting fantasies onto them, a sad little story of loss and partial belonging. On the other hand, it's got all the ingredients of myth, green skin, an invisible country, bells heard through the earth, an almost lost language, a girl who walks out of the fairy world and marries into human society. It satisfies two hungers at once, the hunger for explanation, what really happened, and the hunger for enchantment. What if the world really does touch something stranger just beyond the hedgerow? You can see that in the range of interpretations people still offer. At the sober end, there's the refugee children model, kids from a nearby, possibly Flemish, community displaced by warfare or famine, sick from malnutrition, misdescribed by baffled villagers. The green colour might be diet-related anemia, or some temporary effect of starvation. The St. Martin's Land might be a garbled place name or a reference to a local church. The underground travel might be a half-remembered stumble through mines, quarries, or hollow tracks. A step more speculative, there are psychological readings. Maybe the girl's description of her homeland reflects trauma, a world remembered as dim and constricted, because that's how it felt, not how it literally was. Maybe the underground journey is an after-the-fact rationalisation of a period of captivity or hiding. Folklorists go further. They see in the Green Children echoes of older European motifs, visitors from the other world, changelings swapped by fairies, people who can only eat one kind of food from their original realm, the dangers of crossing between worlds. On that view, the Woolpit episode might be a real incident later absorbed into a story pattern that was already there, or a pure legend retrofitted with local names to give it weight. Then there are the modern, fully imaginative leaps, parallel universes, hollow earths, aliens. Those say more about contemporary taste than about 12th century Suffolk, but they're part of the story's life now. They show how eager we still are to turn unresolvable puzzles into portals. All of those readings circle back to one central stubborn question. When the survivor talked about an underground world of perpetual twilight, what was she trying to say? Maybe she meant exactly what a geographer would mean. A low-lying, misty landscape you reach by following a ditch or a tunnel-like path. Maybe she meant what a frightened child means. A place that felt cramped, shadowy, and inescapable compared to here. Maybe by the time anyone bothered to write it down, her words had already been translated into the nearest available mythic language. Not a poor settlement in a hollow, but a country beneath ours where the sun never shines. We can't decode her sentence with certainty, but the attempt to understand it is precisely why the Green Children still matter. They force us to practice a kind of double vision, to see the hard, ordinary possibilities, war, hunger, migration, sick kids turning up where no one expects them, and at the same time to see how easily those realities slide into stories of other worlds as listeners reach for frameworks big enough to hold their unease. In the end, the tale doesn't just preserve a medieval marvel, it preserves a medieval moment of contact, between insiders and outsiders, between tellers and listeners, between the explained and the unexplainable. That moment is still with us. Every time a stranger arrives speaking a language we don't know, every time we encounter suffering we can't easily fit into our categories, we're back in that Woolpit field, deciding what kind of story we're going to tell. So where does that leave us? We've walked through the most grounded options. 2 displaced children from a nearby, probably poorer community. Maybe Flemish, maybe just from the next lord's estate over. Malnourished enough that their skin looked wrong. Speaking a dialect no one in Woolpit had heard before. Their memories half-formed, half-translated, filtered through fear and the expectations of the adults around them. We've looked at the geography. Sunken lanes that feel like tunnels, marshy lowlands that stay misty and dim, woods that swallow sound, all within realistic walking distance. We've considered the medicine, greenish skin as a sign of starvation, anemia, or some temporary dietary imbalance that later corrected when they started eating normal village food. We've traced the folklore, the way Europe already had stories of children from elsewhere, of fairy realms with their own food rules, of people slipping across boundaries they shouldn't cross. How a single strange incident could get pulled into those currents and reshaped without anyone meaning to lie. We've even acknowledged the more speculative fronts, psychological trauma, parallel worlds, the whole spectrum of modern wonder-seeking, and seen how each of those tells us more about the storyteller than about Woolpit itself. Put all that together, and the most historically modest conclusion is something like this. In the 12th century, somewhere around Woolpit, something happened involving real children, real hunger, and real confusion. The story that survives is a late stylized and probably embroidered echo of that event. But if we're honest, we can't go much further than that. We don't know their original names. We don't know exactly where they set out from, or what killed the boy. We don't know how faithfully the girl's words were recorded, or how many retellings bent her world into a more satisfying shape. We don't even know how green they actually looked. The record is too thin. 2 medieval writers, each at a distance. No corroborating documents, no parish register to cross-check, no bones we can test, no abandoned village we can securely match to St. Martin's Land. Just a few paragraphs written decades later, already half-story by the time ink hit parchment. That uncertainty is exactly what keeps the tale alive. If we had a neat answer, refugee children from X, case closed, Woolpit would be a historical footnote, a sad, instructive anecdote. Instead, it hovers. It forces us to sit with a question that can't be reduced to a spreadsheet. How do we hold events that are probably ordinary and possibly extraordinary at the same time? The Green Children invite a particular kind of attention, the kind that respects evidence, but also recognizes its limits, the kind that can say, here's what seems most likely, without pretending that's the same thing as certainty. The kind that can admit, part of what we're drawn to here is not knowing. There's a quiet discipline in that. It's the same discipline we need when we look at any deep past, whether it's medieval Suffolk, or the early humans clawing their way through climate catastrophe, or the mysterious bottlenecks and branchings in our own evolution. If you're curious about that much older, deeper mystery, the one where a tiny band of survivors nearly lost our entire species and somehow didn't. I've written a book all about those prehistoric secrets, how a few thousand people on a fragile planet set the stage for everything that came after. You can read more about it and pick up a copy at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, I'd love to hear what you make of Woolpit. If you had to put money on one explanation, not as a fantasy but as your best guess, what would you choose? Refugee kids? Folklore swallowing a real incident? Something stranger? Tell me your theory in the comments, and while you're there, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel. If you found yourself thinking new thoughts about an old legend, it really does help if you like this video, leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. That's what tells the algorithm there's still an audience for slow, careful stories about things we can't quite explain. In the end, the Green Children of Woolpit may never give up their final secret. But maybe that's the point. Some stories are less about solving a puzzle and more about learning how to live with the edges of what we can know, standing in that field with the villagers, with the frightened children, and with our own curiosity, listening for a voice from a dim green world just beyond the hedgerow.